Hey there. Tonight, we are stepping into an Egyptian darkness lit by fire, incense, and the low red glow of a god's anger. Because somewhere between the first sunrise and the first human mistake, the gods imagined a lioness so terrible that even heaven would one day fear her. If this story pulls you in, leave a like, subscribe, and settle close to the fire with me for a while. Now let the room grow dim. Loosen your shoulders, unclench your jaw, and take one slow breath. Because this tale begins before cities, before temples, before kings, when the world was still damp from creation and the first light had only just learned how to shine. Before stone walls rose over the Nile, before scribes pressed signs into clay, or priests carried bowls of beer through painted halls, there was water. Endless water. Dark water. Still water that did not ripple because there was nothing yet to disturb it. The Egyptians called it Nun, the deep without shore, the old flood that existed before memory could even decide what memory was. If you were standing there with me, and honestly I am not sure either of us would enjoy it for very long, you would see no horizon, no reeds, no birds, no glittering river, only a waiting dark that felt more ancient than silence. Then, slowly, the first rising, a mound, a brightness, a presence gathering itself from the deep. The sun god emerged, self-made, self-named, carrying within him the authority to shape order out of that patient black water. This was Ra, radiant and terrible, not terrible in the cartoonish way of later stories, but terrible the way the sun is terrible when it has the whole sky to itself and no cloud dares cross its face. He looked upon the emptiness, and the emptiness changed. Land lifted. Air opened. Light began to move. Time, which had not existed in any useful sense, suddenly found a rhythm. Day and night started circling one another. Heat touched cold. Dry ground pushed back against wet darkness. You can almost feel the first wind crossing the new earth, carrying the smell of silt and hot stone, a smell that would one day cling to temple floors, farmers' hands, and the fur of desert animals waiting in shade. This first world was not gentle, but it was ordered. That mattered more. The Egyptians believed order was sacred, and not the dull kind of order that sits in a neat row doing nothing interesting. I mean living order, balance, measure, rightness, the invisible pattern that keeps rivers in their beds, stars in their courses, and people from turning into a noisy disaster. They called that balance Ma'at. It was truth, justice, proportion, the straightness of things. And from the very beginning, the universe needed protecting, because anything made can be unmade. That is where the fear enters. Ra was not merely a shining creator drifting pleasantly through a golden sky. He was a ruler, and rulers watch. He saw what was growing in the world he had made. He saw movement, hunger, ambition, joy, birth, struggle. He saw the promise of beauty, yes, but also the possibility of defiance. The Egyptians understood something I have always found strangely mature about them. They did not imagine divine power as soft by default. They knew that the same force that ripens grain can crack the earth with heat. The same sun that gives life can also burn fields white and leave bones clean in the desert. So hidden within the brilliance of Ra was a second truth. Fury. Not random anger, not a childish tantrum, but divine wrath waiting like a coal under ash. A god who governs all things must also possess the power to correct, to punish, to destroy what threatens the order of the world. The older the civilization, the less sentimental it usually becomes about that fact. And from that truth, from the eye of Ra, from the living projection of his will, she emerged. Sekhmet. Even her name feels like a blade drawn slowly from a sheath. The powerful one, the mighty one, the goddess whose presence in Egyptian thought carried both fever and protection, both slaughter and healing. She was not an afterthought and not an ornament. She was the moment divine anger became flesh, or perhaps more accurately, Lioness. Imagine the first glimpse. A female body, upright and regal, crowned with a solar disk, but above the human throat and shoulders, the head of a lioness, ears alert, muzzle poised, eyes fixed and merciless. Not wild in the careless sense. Controlled. Intensely controlled. That is what makes her frightening. The lioness does not waste effort. She watches. She chooses. She moves when movement matters. Every feature in her iconography tells you the same thing. Precision. Authority. Violence held on a short leash until it is not. The Egyptians knew lionesses from the edges of their world. They were hunters of the desert margins, sleek muscles under tawny fur, patient as drought, sudden as falling stone. A male lion may look more theatrical with his mane and royal posture, but the lioness does the killing. She stalks, waits, closes the distance, and commits with absolute clarity. That mattered to Egyptian religious imagination. When they gave wrath a face, they gave it hers. And she was beautiful. That is important too. Terrible things in ancient religion are often beautiful because beauty makes them harder to dismiss. Her temples showed her poised, symmetrical, magnificent. The warm curve of the lioness muzzle set above the calm line of a woman's body. Her statues sat with such still dignity that one could almost forget the theological fact they were meant to communicate. If cosmic order is threatened, she will rise. You can picture a priest entering a sanctuary at dawn. Stone cool under bare feet. Incense lingering from the night before. A narrow bar of sun crossing the floor and creeping slowly toward the seated image of Sekhmet. At first the statue is only dark silhouette. Then the light catches the face, the carved cheeks, the hard, still eyes, the round disc above the head, and suddenly the whole room seems to remember what sort of world it belongs to. Not a soft one, a balanced one. In some traditions, Sekhmet is described simply as the daughter of Ra. In others, more carefully, she is his eye, which is not quite the same thing. The eye of Ra is his active force, his outward striking power, his gaze turned into action. This detail matters, because it means Sekhmet is not merely related to divine wrath. She is divine wrath, operating independently. She is what happens when the sun does not just illuminate wrongdoing, but responds to it. That solar connection saturated everything about her. She belonged to the noon heat that presses against the skull and makes distance shimmer. She belonged to the desert wind that arrives with dust in its teeth. She belonged to fevers, epidemics, dry breath, hot skin, and the sort of summer silence that makes birds disappear for an hour because even they are tired of being alive in such brightness. Yet the Egyptians, in their usual unnerving wisdom, did not stop there. The same goddess who could send plague could also stay it. The same hand that loosed burning arrows of disease could withdraw them. The same lioness who prowled at the edges of slaughter also guarded thresholds against evil. This is one of the reasons she endured. Simplicity is forgettable. Contradiction is memorable. Honestly, when modern people first meet Sekhmet, many try to place her neatly into a category. War goddess, destruction goddess, sun goddess, plague goddess, healer, protector, and the answer, in the most Egyptian way possible, is yes. All of it. She is what happens when a civilization refuses to separate danger from safety too cleanly. The knife that cuts infection also cuts flesh. The fire that sterilizes can also consume the house. That was not hypocrisy. It was reality. Long before the famous stories of divine punishment took shape in full literary form, lioness goddesses already haunted Egypt's sacred imagination. Regional cults honored feline protectresses associated with kingship, heat, and battlefield violence. Over time, these local powers intertwined, differentiated, and borrowed traits from one another. Bastet, gentler in later imagination, though not originally harmless, stood in one relation to the sun's force. Sekhmet stood in another. The Egyptian pantheon was less like a neat family tree and more like a river delta, branching, rejoining, carrying the same sacred water through different names and places. But Sekhmet remained distinct in mood. She was the sharpened edge. Priests invoked her when illness swept through communities, when armies marched, when divine protection was needed, precisely because divine punishment was so real. To stand under her favor was to stand near a fire that might keep wolves away, provided you did not stumble into it. Later theology would place her beside Ptah of Memphis, the craftsman god, the thinker whose speech and heart brought forms into being. It is almost funny in a dark theological way. The creator, artisan, and the lioness of annihilation sharing a household. Yet the pairing makes sense if you stay with it. Creation and destruction are not enemies. They are colleagues. One shapes, the other tests. One builds, the other removes corruption. Between them emerges something more stable than softness ever could make. Their son, in many traditions, was Nefertum, associated with the blue lotus, perfumi, youth, and the first sweetness of morning light. So there, in one family, the Egyptians placed a complete vision of reality. Thought and craft in Ptah, wrath and protection in Sekhmet, fragrance, beauty, and renewal in Nefertum. If you were hoping ancient theology would be less psychologically accurate than modern life, I am sorry to disappoint you. Yet even in the peace of temple doctrine, the shadow remained. Everyone knew where Sekhmet had come from. She came from the Eye of Ra, from the point where divine patience ends. You can sense this memory in the way her statues were approached. Priests purified themselves before serving her. Incense was offered. Hymns were spoken with care. Beer and food and flowers could be given, but never casually. To honor Sekhmet was to honor a force that must remain aligned. Appeased, perhaps directed, kept in sacred balance. She was not the goddess one forgot to greet. There are records of hundreds of Sekhmet statues commissioned under Amenhotep III, seated images lining temple spaces in overwhelming number. Lioness face after lioness face, watching eternally from polished stone. Scholars still debate the exact reason for this extraordinary multiplication. Was it political devotion, ritual medicine, plague control, royal display, or all of them at once? We cannot be sure. But the effect is easy to imagine. You enter a court and see not one wrathful goddess, but a whole horizon of her, as if fury itself had been made to sit patiently in rows, waiting for the human world to remember its manners. And perhaps that is the best way to understand her at first, not as chaos, but as waiting consequence. By the time the sun is high over this first part of the story, Sekhmet stands fully formed before us. The lioness head gleams. The solar disk burns quietly above her brow. Heat ripples around the horizon. Incense rises in pale threads toward a painted ceiling. Somewhere outside, desert wind lifts dust from the road and drags it across old stone. Inside, the temple remains cool for another hour or two, and the priests move softly in linen, careful with every gesture. This is the goddess before the blood, the guardian before the frenzy, the divine blade still resting in its sheath. But the world below her is changing already. Human beings are prospering, multiplying, building, trading, laughing, forgetting. Grain fills storage rooms. Voices rise in crowded settlements. Prosperity has a strange effect on memory. It makes people think the order holding them up is natural, permanent, perhaps even theirs, by right. And when that thought begins to spread under the eye of a sun god, it does not stay a thought for long. Soon, the old balance will strain. Soon, offerings will thin, and arrogance will grow warm in the human chest. Soon, Ra will look down and decide that the world he made has become noisy in the wrong way. And when he makes that decision, he will not send rain, nor warning, nor a mild reprimand from the edge of a cloud. He will send her. By the next part of the tale, Egypt is no longer an untouched divine sketch, lit only by first sunlight. It is inhabited now. Paths have been worn into the earth. Storage rooms smell of grain. Boats move on the Nile, with reed ropes creaking softly in damp hands. Children are born. Old people die. And the same river that glows silver at dawn carries chaff, gossip, fish scales, and temple reflections by evening. The world has become lived in, which means it has also become forgetful. At first, the prosperity is almost lovely to watch. If you were standing on a rise above the floodplain, you would see ribbons of green spread beside the river and then fade into the gold-red margins of the desert. Mud brick houses cluster in soft rectangular shadows. Courtyards hold jars of water cooling under linen. Date palms stir when wind bothers to cross the land. Somewhere, a potter turns his wheel. Somewhere else, a woman grinds grain with the slow, patient rhythm of someone whose body has done this 10,000 times already. Donkeys complain. Geese complain even more. Honestly, geese seem to have considered themselves divine authorities in every century, and I can only respect the consistency. In the middle of this ordinary beauty, the temples continue their work. Morning after morning, priests wash, dress, recite, and carry offerings inward. Floors are swept. Incense is measured. Beer is poured. Bread is placed. Hymns rise into chambered roofs painted with stars. In Memphis, where Ptah's presence shapes theology like a thought made into stone, Sekhmet is not treated as mythic scenery. She is active, invoked, appeased, consulted. Her name belongs to medicine as much as to war, to purification as much as to terror. This is where her complexity settles more deeply into Egyptian life. She is not simply the goddess who could kill. She is also the goddess who must be asked not to. That is a different sort of power. You can imagine a physician priest stepping into her temple carrying a small box of remedies. Bronze tools wrapped carefully in linen. Herbs dried and tied in neat bundles. Jars of oil and resin. The patient waiting outside may have fever, or a wound, or a swelling that has frightened an entire household into silence. The priest knows practical treatment matters. He also knows practical treatment alone would have seemed incomplete in a world where disease itself could be imagined as a divine arrow. So he works in both directions. He cleans the wound. He speaks the words. He applies the poultice. He invokes Sekhmet, not despite her association with sickness, but because of it. One asks the hand that sent the blow to lift it. The Egyptians did not think contradiction weakened a goddess. Contradiction proved she was real enough to resemble the world. Fire cooks and destroys. Water nourishes and drowns. The river feeds Egypt and also threatens it every season. Why should divinity be simpler than nature? Sekhmet could blaze as plague and arrive again as cure. She could stand at a king's side in battle and at a sickbed in anxious lamplight. When later texts call physicians the priests of Sekhmet, it is not a poetic flourish. It is an admission. Healing belongs partly to the one who knows how death moves. Her bond with Ptah deepens this idea beautifully. Ptah thinks the world into form. He brings being into shape through heart and tongue, through conceived order made audible. But form without defense is fragile. A crafted world can be broken. A civilization can carve statues, raise pylons, polish floors, and still be one act of arrogance away from collapse. So beside the craftsman stands the lioness. Creation and preservation require force. And then there is Nefertem, their son, rising from lotus bloom and morning fragrance. He feels almost gentle beside his mother, almost like a cool cloth placed against a fevered brow. Yet that contrast is exactly the point. Out of wrath and thought comes renewal. Out of danger comes perfume. Out of heat comes bloom. Still, even with family around her and ritual woven daily around her image, Sekhmet remains dangerous in imagination. The danger is not theatrical. It is structural. People live under the sun. The sun gives. The sun withholds. The same power that ripens wheat can harden mud into brick or crack it apart. If Ra is the source of sovereign order, then his eye, his active force, must remain near the center of political life too. That is why kings relied on her. Pharaohs wanted to be associated with divine force that did not hesitate. In inscriptions, the king can appear as lion, bull, falcon, radiant conqueror, but Sekhmet gave these metaphors a sharper tone. Through her, royal violence became not mere dominance, but cosmic correction. To strike enemies was to defend Ma'at. To subdue rebellion was to prevent the world from fraying. In temple art, she sits upright, calm, almost severe in her composure. The pose matters. She is not shown lunging wildly through space. She is enthroned, contained, dignified. The message is simple and chilling. Proper wrath does not need to flail. It only needs legitimacy. Some scholars argue that the huge proliferation of Sekhmet statues in certain periods had much to do with attempts to ward off epidemics. It is debated exactly how people imagined such protection working. Were the statues devotional anchors, ritual barriers, vessels of presence? We cannot be sure, but picture an entire processional court lined with lioness faces in black stone, each one polished smooth by light, each one bearing the same solar disk, the same poised ferocity. The effect would not be subtle. A parent bringing a sick child to a shrine of Sekhmet was not approaching a gentle mother. They were approaching power in its most concentrated form and asking it to spare what it had the ability to destroy. That takes a grim kind of faith. Not naive faith. Not faith that says nothing bad can happen, but faith that says the force ruling sickness and recovery is still worth speaking to. Outside the temples, meanwhile, human society continues to grow. Fields yield. Storehouses swell. Trade routes fill. Tools improve. Towns become louder. Success arrives the way it so often does. First as relief, then as confidence, then as entitlement. Humanity does not wake up one day and decide in a dramatic chorus to rebel against heaven. No, people drift into arrogance, the way a river drifts into flood, inch by inch, sediment by sediment, while telling themselves everything still looks normal. Offerings become less careful. Ritual becomes more routine. Gratitude thins. The gods are still named, but the naming grows habitual. A person bows because that is what one does. Another skips a rite because the grain still came in and no lightning struck the roof. A third grows prosperous, enough to think the prosperity reflects personal merit more than cosmic gift. The Egyptians were not strangers to social memory. They kept names, records, lineages, rituals, formulas, and calendars with astonishing devotion. Yet their myths repeatedly circle one warning. Human beings forget, not all at once. Forgetting usually dresses itself as practicality, as efficiency, as confidence, as the little shrug that says, "Surely, this one omission does not matter." In the stories surrounding Sekhmet, this human drift becomes more and more dangerous because it is not just impiety, but disorder. People begin to imagine themselves outside the structure that made them. They become noisy in the wrong way. That phrase matters. Not noisy like children at a feast. Not noisy like market stalls or musicians on a festival day. Noisy in the cosmic sense. A disruptive swelling of ego against the arrangement of things. There are versions in which humanity openly plots against Ra. Versions in which he grows old and people mock his weakness. Versions in which rebellion spreads through murmurs, irreverence, disobedience, and spiritual neglect. The details shift, but the core remains steady. Human beings cease to remember proportion. The image is easy to build in the mind. A once reverent sanctuary, now entered carelessly. Dust on altars, beer not offered, priests muttering concern to one another in side chambers, cool with stone and shadow. Outside, in streets full of trade and chatter, people laughing too freely at what should still command reverence. Someone boasting that power lies with men now. Someone else repeating it. A local shrine neglected because labor seems more urgent. Sacred names shortened into habit, then into convenience, then into absence. And the sun still watches. I like to imagine the way evening would fall over such a society. The Nile darkening to bronze, reeds whispering, a courtyard meal being laid out, bread broken, oil lamps lit, a family speaking quietly about market matters, marriages, repairs, debts. Nothing outwardly apocalyptic. The terrifying thing is that civilizations often approach disaster looking completely ordinary at supper. Inside the divine sphere, however, concern deepens. Ra sees the swelling insolence. He hears the wrong kind of noise coming from the world below. The stories sometimes present him as wearied by age, his body carrying the strain of sovereignty, his bones silver, his flesh gold, his hair lapis. There is something moving in that picture. A god still radiant, but ancient enough to feel the insolence of the young as a personal abrasion. He has sustained the world, illuminated it, fathered order itself, and now its inhabitants chatter as if the sky made itself. He does not lash out immediately. That is important. Judgment in Egyptian myth often takes shape after observation, counsel, and decision. The divine court gathers. Advice is sought. The possibility of response enters the room like a hot wind through an open door. And authority, in this myth, has a lioness waiting inside it. Before she is released, the world receives signs. In some retellings, warnings come through omens, disturbances, changes in sky and land. Every civilization tells itself it will recognize the turning point clearly when it arrives. And almost every civilization is wrong. So imagine a season that feels slightly off. A wind too hot for the month. Birds lifting from marsh reeds all at once and settling farther off. The sun at noon seeming more white than gold. temple cats restless, priests looking upward a little more often than usual, the river still flowing. Yes, but with that strange heavy hush that makes people pause mid-sentence and then continue as if they had not noticed anything at all. In market spaces, the trade continues. Bread is sold, linen exchanged, pots carried, children chased. A joke is made at the expense of the old gods, and the listeners laugh because laughter feels like freedom until the moment it becomes evidence. Somewhere on a temple wall, Sekhmet sits in painted stillness, Lioness face unchanged, solar disk bright, with mineral color that has outlasted generations of hands and voices. She has not moved. She does not need to move yet, because Sekhmet is not chaos introduced from outside. She is order defending itself. But that turn has not happened quite yet. For now, the divine blade is lifting. Ra has seen enough. The old balance, Mat, no longer feels secure. Human beings have grown too comfortable inside a world they did not make. Reverence has thinned into habit, and habit into neglect. The wrong kind of noise rises from the earth. Not music, not prayer, not even honest grief. Pride. And in the chambers of heaven, pride has consequences. You can almost hear the shift before you see it. Priests speaking more softly. Courtiers growing still. The sense that some threshold has been crossed not by a single dramatic act, but by countless small ones collecting like grains of sand in a flood channel. Then, suddenly, not so suddenly at all, Ra turns toward his eye, toward the force that carries his anger into motion, toward the lioness who has been waiting in polished stone, in painted walls, in temple hymns, in fever and heat and guarded thresholds, toward Sekhmet. When she rises next, it will not be as symbol, nor as seated image, nor as a patient warning lining the courts of kings. She will rise as action, and once her feet touch the earth, the world below will learn the difference between being watched by the sun and being hunted by it. The divine court does not feel like a courtroom in the later human sense. Not exactly. There are no benches polished by anxious hands, no clerks coughing over records, no one pretending neutrality while already deciding the outcome. This is older than that. Colder, too, in its own bright way. The gods gather around Ra in a stillness so complete that even the air seems unwilling to move unless permitted. Picture a chamber not enclosed by ordinary walls, but held in place by authority itself. Gold light spreads across the floor like shallow water. Pillars rise painted with stars and feathers and the long memory of kingship not yet born. Incense curls upward in thin blue lines, dissolving before it reaches a ceiling that feels as distant as the sky above the Nile at noon. Somewhere beyond, the world continues. Reeds shifting, workers bending, children laughing, jars filling, bread baking, arguments flaring and fading. But in here the larger decision forms. Ra speaks. The old stories tell it simply. Humanity has grown insolent. Humanity plots. Humanity has forgotten who made the ordered world in which it walks. Depending on the version, the words change shape, but the feeling remains the same. A father, ruler, and sun god looking down at creatures who have mistaken repeated mercy for weakness. It is not only rebellion that wounds him. It is familiarity, that dangerous human habit of treating the permanent as ordinary. The other gods listen with the care one gives to fire in dry weather. Some support severity immediately. Some counsel response. Some seem less troubled by humanity itself than by the possibility that disorder, once tolerated, spreads like crack lines through painted plaster. The Egyptian universe is not held together by sentiment. It is held together by balance. If that balance is mocked, then the mockery itself becomes a threat larger than any single village or generation. This is what I find so unnerving about the old myth. The gods do not rage because they are surprised by human flaws. They rage because those flaws disrupt the architecture of the cosmos. It is the difference between being annoyed by a noisy guest and hearing a beam in the house begin to split. And then, the Eye of Ra is named. When the eye is spoken of in these stories, it is not merely an organ of sight. It is Ra's will projected outward, his active power, the thing that sees and acts, the thing that can leave him and yet remain him. A dangerous idea, if you sit with it long enough. Imagine your anger stepping out of you, taking on shape, and walking into the world with your full authority still burning inside it. That anger takes the form of Sekhmet, or in some tellings, Hathor, before the blood, transformed by wrath into Sekhmet when the work begins. Egyptian theology loves these fluid boundaries, these divine overlaps where tenderness and destruction can inhabit adjacent rooms of the same being. But whichever name we hold in this moment, the force that descends is the Lioness, the hunter, the red answer to human arrogance. Ra does not need to shout. Command from a god like him does not require volume. He sends her, and the sending is enough. You can almost feel the instant of release. The air tightens. The light shifts from gold towards something harsher, flatter, less forgiving. The eye leaves the sun and enters motion. Somewhere between heaven and the breathing earth, divine judgment gathers fur and claws and the deep chest of a lioness built for the chase. Down below, people do not understand yet. That is usually how catastrophe begins. Not with universal awareness, but with breakfast, with a cartwheel that still needs mending, with a child dropping a cup and being told to watch their hands, with a fisherman checking a net under a sky that looks mostly normal. The extraordinary often enters through the ordinary side door. At first, perhaps there are only signs. The heat comes wrong. Not the healthy heat of a bright Egyptian day when linen flutters and stone warms, and everyone complains a little but keeps working. This heat feels focused, personal. It presses on the back of the neck as if attention itself has weight. Dogs become restless. Birds veer away from open ground. Temple servants glance at the horizon longer than usual. An old woman mutters that the day tastes metallic. No one quite laughs. Then she is there. Not as a statue now. Not as carved basalt polished by offerings. Not as painted relief. Living presence. Solar disk bright above the lioness brow. Muscles rolling under tawny skin, and divine form. A face beautiful and merciless in equal measure. It is one thing to pray before an image, and another thing entirely to realize the image has begun to breathe. Sekhmet enters the human world like drought entering a field. Swiftly, yes, but also with a kind of dreadful naturalness, as if this possibility had always been folded into the design from the beginning. She does not need to announce herself. Her very arrival changes behavior. Voices collapse into silence. Feet back away. Those who were insolent a moment before discover an urgent interest in the ground. But it is too late for embarrassment to function as repentance. The texts remember what follows in broad strokes more than in forensic detail, and perhaps that is a mercy. We do not need the specifics. The idea is enough. The lioness goes among humanity and kills, not with chaotic frenzy at first, but with the clear, unstoppable focus of a hunter carrying out a command it believes entirely righteous. She is divine plague with teeth, royal punishment with paws, noon heat given appetite. Ancient Egyptian art knew how to suggest force without always displaying it. A raised arm, a captive beneath a ruler's grip, a row of enemies turned into symbols rather than individuals. In that same softened but terrible register, let us imagine Sekhmet moving through settlements where laughter had once risen too easily. Courtyards emptying. Sand marked by flight. Doors shut that cannot keep out a goddess. The smell of hot dust and fear mingling with old incense. Spilled beer and river damp. If you were standing there with me, and I truly hope we are not, you would notice one horrifying thing immediately. She does not tire. Human violence tires. Armies tire. Angry men tire. Even vengeance usually burns itself down. But Sekhmet is divine purpose. She does not begin the work with human emotion, and therefore does not end it through human exhaustion. Her strength is solar. The more blood, the more heat seems to gather around her. The red of judgment amplifies itself. One punishment feeds the next. The old stories say blood runs. They say she wades. They say the fields of humanity become red under her. We do not need to dwell there long. Better to hold the image from a distance. The way one watches a storm cross the far side of the valley and understands the orchard beneath it is being stripped tree by tree. Let it stay half-veiled in desert glare and sacred horror. The important thing is this. She exceeds the command. What began as punishment edges toward annihilation. The line between correction and extinction starts to vanish. Ra looks down and sees not merely rebellious humans being humbled, but the possibility that no humans will remain. The ordered world he made may be purified so completely that it will also be emptied. This realization must have struck even the divine court with a kind of cold astonishment. Judgment is one thing. Erasure is another. The same power required to protect creation can, if left unchecked, consume the creation it was meant to defend. It is a lesson civilizations relearn in different costumes every few centuries and always act surprised. Sekhmet, meanwhile, is deep in the hunt. Imagine evening trying and failing to cool the land. The Nile, reflecting a dark red sunset. The western desert holding the day's heat long after the sun has lowered. Far off, temple roofs catch the last light. In villages, doors remain barred. In sanctuaries, prayers have shifted tone. No one asks for victory now. They ask for survival. They ask for the goddess to stop being herself so completely. And perhaps in the divine realm, another unease enters. What if she cannot stop? What if the Eye of Ra, once set loose in this form, cannot be recalled by command alone? Some stories imply exactly this. Not that she rebels against Ra in any dramatic declaration, but that blood has awakened an appetite beyond the original scope of the mission. Wrath has discovered pleasure in execution. Honestly, this is why Sekhmet's story stays lodged in the mind. It is not just about punishment. It is about the terrifying speed with which righteous violence can become self-justifying. The first act says, "This is necessary." The 10th says, "This is effective." The 100th forgets to ask anything at all. Night comes. If night can come properly under such a goddess. Lamps shake in human hands. Reed mats remain empty. Somewhere, a priest lies flat on cool stone, begging every known divine power to intercede. Somewhere else, a mother presses her child against her and whispers the names of gods, the way one throws handful after handful of water at a house fire. The stars above remain beautiful, and that may be the strangest cruelty of all. The universe keeps its order at the scale of constellations, while human order shatters below. By dawn, the next day, the land itself seems altered. Dust is darker in places. The silence after panic is heavier than panic itself. Sekhmet moves through it with the terrible calm of a predator between bursts of action. Alert, blood bright on the lioness mouth of memory, if not of our description. This is not mere rage anymore. It is intoxication. Ra sees it. The gods see it. The lioness will not simply return because she has been told enough has been done. Enough is no longer a meaningful quantity to her. So the problem changes. It is no longer how to punish humanity. It is how to save humanity from the punishment already sent. And that is where the myth turns from horror into something even stranger. Because the only way to stop divine slaughter will not be greater force, nor chains, nor battle against the lioness herself. The Egyptians understood that once such a power is fully awakened, confrontation may only deepen it. You do not outclaw the lioness of the sun. You outwit her. In temple, quiet. Among jars and pigments and ritual knowledge, a plan begins to form. Not a warrior's plan. A brewer's plan. A priest's plan. A plan so odd, it would sound comic if its purpose were not to save the species. Beer. Large quantities of it. Beer brewed thick and then colored red until it resembles blood spread across the ground. We are not there quite yet, but the decision is nearing, like dawn under a closed door. Before the saving deception begins, the world remains suspended in one of the darkest pauses in Egyptian myth. The pause in which a goddess of rightful wrath has almost become the ending of mankind. And all across the land, whether in palace, village, shrine, or reed hut, every living person still breathing waits inside the same silent question. Will the lioness stop, or will the sun wake tomorrow over a world already emptied of us? Morning in the old myth does not arrive gently. It comes with urgency, with priests already moving, with servants carrying jars in both arms, with brewers roused before the birds have fully found their voices. Somewhere the Nile gives off its cool, damp breath, before heat claims the day. Somewhere, temple floors still hold the night's chill. Somewhere beyond walls and courtyards, Sekhmet ranges, and each passing moment matters. Ra has understood what kind of danger now stands before him. Humanity's rebellion was dangerous, yes, but manageable. Sekhmet's delight in destruction is something else. The eye once released cannot be simply switched off like a lamp after supper. The force of divine correction has become a wave gathering its own momentum. If it continues, the fields will be left without singers, the temples without offerers, the river without boats, the ordered world without witnesses. So the gods choose cunning. I love this about Egyptian myth. For all its grandeur, it does not always solve problems with bigger lightning. Sometimes the answer is startlingly practical, almost domestic. Measure, mix, pour. Lay a trap not for an enemy exactly, but for a divine appetite. Beer. Large quantities of it. Beer brewed thick and then colored red until it resembles blood spread across the ground. Now slow down with me here for a moment, because this is one of those scenes that can pass too quickly if told only as plot. Imagine the temple storerooms opening. Clay jars stacked in cool, half-darkness. Dust on the rims. Linen seals loosened by hasty fingers. The thick smell of grain and old fermentation rising into the morning air. Men and women hauling vessels over packed earth. Sandals scraping. Shoulders straining. Arms slick with effort before the day is even fully warm. Priests directing. Voices low but sharp. Bowls of pigment tipped into the beer one after another. Wooden paddles stirring the liquid until the red deepens. A color too dark for wine, too opaque for water, too dreadful to see in such quantity by accident. The beer is poured out over the land. In some tellings, over fields near Dendera. In others, across broad spaces where Sekhmet is expected to pass at dawn. It floods hollows, runs across packed soil, gathers between reeds, glistens in channels and low places. Under the early light, it looks exactly wrong, exactly right for the trap. A plain of blood where no battle has just occurred, red enough to draw the eye, wide enough to stop the goddess in her path. Then the waiting. This pause may be my favorite moment in the whole story, because it contains the entire world holding its breath. Priests step back. Workers retreat. The air warms. Insects begin to move above the surface of the false blood. Somewhere, a bird gives a tentative call and is silent again. The red liquid lies there, reflecting sky in broken pieces. If you were standing beside me then, hidden behind a temple wall or crouched among low stones, you would feel the heat rising from the earth into your calves. You would smell beer beneath the red, that grain-rich, sour sweetness, though perhaps only faintly from a distance. You would hear your own breath too loudly and wish your heartbeat would stop announcing you to every god within earshot. And then she comes. Sekhmet at dawn. Lioness headed. Solar crowned. Fury still alive in every line of her body. She has not slept in the human sense, if such beings sleep at all. She has continued through the night, under stars and moon and the long, cool intervals between killings. The morning does not soften her. Morning belongs to the sun. And so, in a way, mourning belongs to her more than it belongs to anyone. She sees the red flood. This part is told with beautiful simplicity in the old accounts. She mistakes it for blood, or perhaps she does not exactly mistake it. Perhaps in her condition the resemblance is enough. She lowers her head, drinks deeply, drinks again. The goddess who would have emptied the world kneels at a counterfeit river and swallows her own interruption. The image is astonishing if you let it stay in the mind. Lioness, muzzle dark with red drink. Solar disk bright against the growing daylight. The whole plain, smelling not of death, but of fermented grain and mineral pigment, warming under the Egyptian sun. She drinks and drinks until bloodlust begins to blur into intoxication. The thirst that had seemed inseparable from judgment starts to fold in on itself. Beer in ancient Egypt was not a novelty. It was daily life, nourishment, ritual offering, labourer's fuel, social glue. To use beer in this myth is not random comic relief. It is civilization itself, agriculture itself, human craft itself, turned into the means of survival. Grain transformed by fermentation saves the grain growers from divine extinction. There is a deep irony there, and the Egyptians knew how to honor irony without flattening it. Sekhmet drinks until the violent clarity leaves her. Her eyes dim, or soften, or lose that fixed, devouring concentration. The body that had moved with such lethal precision slows. The hunt dissolves. Intoxication enters where wrath had ruled. She grows satisfied, perhaps confused, perhaps sleepy, perhaps merely altered enough that the compulsion toward annihilation breaks apart like a clay cup dropped on stone. Then she lies down, or stumbles, or sleeps. The versions vary in flavor, but the outcome remains blessedly the same. The lioness stops. Imagine the first human being who realizes she has stopped. Perhaps a priest hidden behind a pillar, looking through incense smoke. Perhaps a worker with hands still red, stained from pigment. Perhaps someone far away who notices only that the terrible movement through the land has ceased. The sort of stillness after danger that feels unreal at first, because the body expects another blow and does not yet trust the silence. What happens next in the myth is not triumph in the modern sense. No one has defeated Sekhmet. No one has disproved her power. If anything, the story proves the opposite. She came within a breath of wiping out humankind and was turned only by divine strategy and the oldest cultivated drink in the Nile Valley. The lesson is not that wrath is weak. The lesson is that wrath must be redirected before it becomes final. When Sekhmet wakes, the world has changed. Or rather, the relationship between goddess and world has changed. The lioness who rose as unstoppable punishment now returns in altered mood. In many tellings, she is soothed, pacified, returned to a more benevolent or at least manageable form. Sometimes the transformation leans back toward Hathor, the radiant goddess of beauty, sexuality, music, joy, and intoxication. The same divine force that nearly ended humanity is folded back into celebration, pleasure, and festival. This merging is one of the strangest and most beautiful features of Egyptian religion. The line between destroyer and benefactor is not erased, but negotiated. A goddess can be both because reality is both. Beer that saves is still beer that intoxicates. Music that delights is still music that can loosen restraint. Love and danger often share a doorway. Festivals eventually grew around this memory. Ritual drinking, music, celebration, acts of joy that were also acts of remembrance. The Feast of Drunkenness, as later scholars would call aspects of these observances, did not celebrate mindless excess. It remembered the day humanity survived because a goddess drank red beer instead of blood. To become drunk in ritual context was to reenact that hinge between extinction and mercy. Sekhmet did not vanish after this. She remained dangerous, remained honored, remained the goddess physicians served, and kings invoked, and plague anxious communities tried to appease. Temples did not melt down her statues or pretend the old event had rendered her harmless. That would have been absurd. One does not survive divine wrath by forgetting it. One survives by remembering balance. If you walk through museums now and find her there, black granite or diorite, seated with hands on knees, body upright, face leonine and remote, it can be easy to think of her as static. But ancient Egyptians would have seen motion inside that stillness. They would have seen the memory of the time she crossed the boundary between symbol and event. The time the Eye of Ra became too successful. The time beer saved the world. There is something almost medicinal in the way the myth resolves. Not soft, not sentimental, medicinal. A fever broken not by denying its severity, but by countering it with another substance, another process, another calculated act. This fits Sekhmet perfectly. She remains the lady of epidemics and the lady of healing because she never truly stopped being either. The line between poison and cure is often only dosage, timing, direction. And what of Ra? He remains the old sovereign, wiser perhaps, or at least reminded that the powers issuing from him can outrun intention. The sun still crosses the sky. The world continues. Order is restored, but not through innocence, through intervention, through memory, through a story that says human beings survive not because they are blameless, but because destruction can sometimes be turned aside at the last possible moment. The Nile keeps moving. Silt keeps gathering on sandals and boat hulls. Priests go back to sweeping floors and carrying bread. Workers return to fields. Children chase one another through courtyards with dust on their ankles and no real understanding of how close the world once came to ending. Somewhere in a sanctuary, beer is offered again. This time not as trap, but as right. Somewhere in Memphis, a physician-priest murmurs Sekhmet's name over a patient and hopes the burning force will arrive as cure rather than affliction. This is how myth settles into daily life. It does not remain only a dramatic event in the far sacred past. It becomes pattern, warning, ritual memory. It teaches people how to think about heat, plague, anger, excess, and mercy. It teaches that divine power must be honored in all its forms, not only the forms that feel pleasant. It teaches that joy itself may be a negotiated peace with forces that once threatened to unmake everything. Humanity in this story is not saved by deserving salvation. It is saved because the gods decide not to finish the work, and because divine cunning finds a way to satisfy wrath without completing extinction. That is a humbling thing to live under. It leaves no room for easy self-importance. Perhaps that is why the Egyptians kept Sekhmet close. Better the lioness at the threshold, named and fed and honored, than forgotten until she must be rediscovered the hard way. By the end of this part, the fields are no longer red with danger, but with memory. The jars are empty. The goddess sleeps or wakes transformed. The species remains. Temple walls once more hold their cool breath against the noon outside. Incense rise. Scribes sharpen reeds. Physicians prepare remedies. Somewhere, under a painted roof, a hymn begins. It will not praise a harmless goddess. It will praise a powerful one, a mighty one, a lioness whose rage almost became the last horizon of mankind, whose stopping became one of the strangest mercies ever remembered on the banks of the Nile. But stories like this do not endure simply because they are dramatic. They endure because they leave questions smoldering after the flames are banked. What sort of world requires wrath to defend order? What sort of people need to remember annihilation in order to value joy? What happens to a civilization that worships both beauty and catastrophe in the same sacred breath? Those questions remain with us still, and in the next part, they begin to move outward, beyond the old temples, beyond the immediate terror, into the long afterlife of Sekhmet's memory, where lioness statues wait in rows, physicians whisper prayers over fevers, kings borrow her force, and Egypt spends centuries learning how to live beside a goddess who once drank toward sleep while the whole human race waited to see if it had another morning coming. What survives a moment like that is never only fear. Fear burns hot and then cools. What lasts is arrangement, placement, repetition. A civilization deciding, century after century, where to set the image of the lioness, how often to speak her name, how much incense to place before her, what songs to sing so that wrath remembers its boundary and healing remembers its source. So let us move forward now, slowly, into the long afterlife of Sekhmet inside Egyptian life. Morning in Memphis, not the first Memphis, not the last, because cities like people change their skin without fully surrendering their bones. The Nile slides by in its patient green-brown silence. Barges knock softly against moorings. Bakers are already working. Scribes have begun their neat black lines. The sun rises over walls, shrines, courtyards, workshops, and sleeping dogs. And within temple spaces that hold a cooler breath than the streets outside, Sekhmet waits in stone. There she is, seated, upright, calm in posture, dangerous in implication. Lioness head lifted, wig carved in ordered lines, solar disk above the brow, hands resting on the knees in perfect composure. If you saw only one statue, you might think the Egyptians admired repetition a little too much, which, to be fair, they did. But the rows matter. Temple complexes could hold not one Sekhmet but dozens, even hundreds in some kingly programs. Each image, a kind of repeated containment. a visual litany, a carved negotiation with peril. I have always found that strange in the best possible way. When modern people fear something, we usually hide it, minimize it, rename it, or pretend we have outgrown it. The Egyptians did nearly the opposite. They multiplied it into view. They gave it a throne. They polished it. They placed offerings before it. They made sure divine danger remained near enough to be addressed before it had reason to become surprise. In the reign of Amenhotep III, especially, Sekhmet seems to bloom across temple landscapes in astonishing numbers. Black granodiorite lionesses seated and standing, each one nearly identical at first glance, until your eye slows and begins to notice minute differences in inscription, proper sin, weathering, the angle of the mouth, the gravity in the gaze. Scholars still debate the exact purpose of these vast statue programs. Some emphasize royal piety. Some see healing rites linked to calendrical festivals. Some suspect the king, aging and increasingly aware of bodily fragility, surrounded himself with carved forms of dangerous protection in the hope that what could cause plague might also choose to avert it. That is very Egyptian. Not choosing between destroyer and savior, but approaching the same force from the correct angle. If you were standing in one of those temple courts with me, perhaps in the early morning before the full heat arrived, you would feel the stone cooling your senses even while the day warmed. You would smell incense and dust and old mineral surfaces recently washed by libations. Priests would pass in clean linen. A sistrum might sound in some neighboring space, a bright metallic shaking that seems too delicate for a lioness, until you remember that music also pacifies, and that Hathor and Sekhmet forever lean into one another like neighboring flames. Each statue would feel less like decoration and more like a station in an argument. Stay seated. Stay honored. Stay full of offerings. Stay on our side of the bargain. The bargain mattered because sickness was never theoretical. Fever moved through households. Infection entered, cuts no larger than a reed scratch. Eyes clouded. Breath thickened. Bellies cramped. Children weakened with terrifying speed. A bad season could feel as if the air itself had chosen a side. In such a world, Sekhmet's character was not quaint mythology. She was explanatory architecture. When disease came, it had a face. When healing came, it came from the same hand, turned gently. This is why physician priests served her. This is why healing texts and protective spells could call upon lioness power, not despite its violence, but because of it. The logic is unnerving and precise. The force that wounds is the force best qualified to remove the wound. The fever goddess understands fever from the inside. The Lady of Pestilence can command pestilence to depart because it is, in some sense, already her servant. Imagine an Egyptian healer at work. A shaded room. A patient laid on a woven bed, sweating through linen. Family waiting in that taut silence known to every age. Bowls of water nearby. Herbs crushed into paste. Honey glistening in a jar. Copper instruments catching a little light. The healer murmurs words over the patient, not because words replace remedies, but because remedies and words belong together. Matter and utterance. Ointment and invocation. The name of Sekhmet, spoken not as scream, but as alignment. There is no contradiction here for the Egyptians. A poultice may be practical. A prayer may be practical. To us, those categories separate. To them, they braid. And there is a tenderness in this that I do not think gets enough attention. Sekhmet is frightening. Yes. But to call on her in sickness is also to trust that the blazing force of the universe can choose not merely to spare, but to mend. To imagine that behind the lioness mouth there remains a discipline capable of stopping its own appetite and turning toward repair. Sometimes I think that is why her statues sit so still. Stillness is the achievement. Stillness is victory. The lioness, not lunging, is already the answer to a prayer. Kings understood this too. Though kings being kings, they often preferred the more theatrical parts first. Royal inscriptions love a good comparison, and few comparisons flatter a pharaoh like likening him to Sekhmet in battle. The ruler charges against enemies like the raging lioness. The ruler burns foreign lands with the eye of Ra. The ruler is beloved by Sekhmet because his fury maintains order against chaos. It is royal propaganda, of course, but royal propaganda often reveals genuine mental furniture. Egyptian kingship did not imagine violence as embarrassing necessity. It imagined violence as sacred tool that had to remain tied to order or else become monstrous. That last part is easy to forget. The myth of Sekhmet already contained the warning. Excessive punishment threatens creation itself. A king borrowing lioness power must imply control, or he edges toward the same terrifying overreach as the goddess in her blood hunger. So, inscriptions praise force, but ritual surrounds force. Coronations, offerings, jubilees, festivals. The king is fierce because he is lawful. Or at least, that is what the kingdom hopes. The common people, meanwhile, live beneath these grand ideas in much smaller rhythms. A mother ties an amulet around a child's neck. A soldier mutters a prayer before marching south. A brewer pours the first little splash onto the ground before drinking the rest. A priestess shakes a sistrum in a chapel where light falls in bars through stone screens. Someone sick enough to feel close to death hears Sekhmet's name and does not know whether to be comforted or terrified. Probably both. Honestly, probably always both. This double feeling may be the most honest response to her. She is not safe in the modern sentimental sense, but she is reliable in a harder sense. She does what she is. If properly honored, properly addressed, properly remembered, she may become the wall between a household and disaster. If neglected, mocked, or forgotten, well, the old stories have already shown what happens when balance slips. It is remarkable how often beer remains in the background of her festivals, not always front and center in every period, not always described in the same way, but there it is, hovering around ritual memory like a golden red echo. Drink, music, dance, intoxication, release. Scholars looking at these rites sometimes emphasize catharsis, and that makes sense. A society that lives close to plague, crop failure, divine uncertainty, and political fragility needs forms of controlled excess. It needs moments where terror is metabolized into celebration. It needs ritual occasions where the thing that once nearly destroyed the world is invited to sit down, drink, listen, and be pleased instead. There is something profoundly human in that. We do versions of it now, though usually with less elegance. We throw parties after crises. We laugh too hard after funerals. We make festivals from old fears, because otherwise the fears keep too much of the house to themselves. In Egyptian hands, this became theology. The Feast of Drunkenness was not merely an excuse to become disorderly. It remembered a cosmic near miss. It told participants that joy itself might be preventative medicine. Let the goddess drink. Let her be delighted. Let music reach where argument cannot. Let red liquid become celebration instead of slaughter. I imagine one of those nights sometimes. Lamps flickering across painted columns. Musicians seated cross-legged with lutes and rattles. Perfume in the warm air, beer sweetened, thick and plentiful. Women and men moving in dance that is half devotion and half relief. Priestesses of Hathor smiling in that enigmatic way sacred performers sometimes do, as if they know exactly how thin the wall is between ecstasy and terror and are comfortable standing on it. Outside, the desert holds its darkness. Inside, the lioness is being lulled by civilization itself. This may be why Sekhmet never truly disappears. Even when other gods rise or merge or lose political centrality, a civilization can outgrow certain symbols if those symbols no longer describe reality. But disease, wrath, correction, heat, and the need for controlled force do not vanish. So neither does she. By now, perhaps you can feel the pattern. The mythic event in which Sekhmet nearly unmade humankind becomes the key that unlocks her later roles. The healer makes sense because the destroyer came first. The protective amulet makes sense because the threat remains real. The endless rows of statues make sense because repetition is containment. The ritual beer makes sense because memory has to be embodied to remain useful. And all of this leaves Egypt living in a remarkable intimacy with danger. Not abstract danger, named danger, dressed danger, consecrated danger. They feed it, carve it, sing to it, ask favors from it, ask mercy from it, ask it to heal the very wounds it once represented. That is not contradiction. That is a theology with its eyes open. As centuries pass, empires bend and shift around the Nile. Dynasties rise, falter, renew. Foreigners come. Languages layer over one another. Temples expand, are repaired, are neglected, are rebuilt. Through it all, the lioness persists, sometimes in the center, sometimes at the edge, but always ready to explain why the world can feel both ordered and one hot breath away from disaster. And that is where we need to go next. Because if Sekhmet lives not only in myths but in medicine, kingship, festival, and stone, then the final question becomes even more intimate. What did ordinary Egyptians actually feel in her presence? Not what kings claimed, not what priests inscribed, but what a person with a fever, or a mother with a sick child, or a soldier facing battle, or an old man lighting incense at dusk, believed the lioness might do. To answer that, we have to step closer out of the grand temple court and into the smaller rooms where fear becomes personal, where incense clings to plaster, where amulets rest warm against the skin, and where the great Lioness of Egypt waits not in theory, but at the edge of a single human life. So let us step closer now, past the pylons and stone courts, past the kingly boasting, past the rows of polished statues seated in their disciplined eternity. Let us enter the smaller Egypt, the one held in rooms no scribe thought important enough to carve on a temple wall. Mud, brick walls, reed mats, oil lamps, a baby asleep in the corner, a cough in the darkness, a bowl of water catching a little moonlight. This is where Sekhmet becomes intimate. A child wakes hot with fever. That sentence would have frightened an ancient Egyptian household more quickly than many formal omens. Fever changes everything. The room that held ordinary life an hour ago now becomes a borderland. Adults speak more softly. Someone touches the child's forehead and keeps the hand there a little too long. Someone else goes for water. A lamp is trimmed. The night, which had seemed manageable, narrows into the small, blazing body on the bed. You know that feeling when everyone in a room is trying not to alarm one another, and that very effort makes the fear sharper. Ancient Egypt knew it too. In such moments, Sekhmet is no distant theological concept. She is explanation. She is possibility. She is what has entered the room, or what might yet be persuaded to leave it. An amulet is brought out, perhaps faience blue-green, cool in the hand, perhaps shaped with a lioness face, or inscribed with words invoking the goddess to drive out pestilence. A healer may be sent for if one can be found quickly. Meanwhile, the household does what households always do. They improvise at the edge of knowledge. They cool cloths. They raise the child a little. They murmur reassurances for themselves as much as for the patient. And somewhere in the midst of practical care, a name is spoken. Sekhmet. Not loudly. Not accusingly. More like the name of a powerful official whose attention must be carefully redirected before she signs the wrong decree. This mixture of domestic tenderness and cosmic dread fascinates me. The Egyptians did not wall off religion from the body. Divine power moved through symptoms. Heat in the flesh could be interpreted both medically and spiritually, because those were not sealed categories. If the fever broke, remedies had worked, and the goddess had relented. If it rose, perhaps one had not yet found the correct words, the correct offering, the correct alignment. Some modern people hear this and assume helpless superstition. That is too easy, and often too smug. The Egyptian household was doing what households still do under older names. Searching for pattern, combining what can be done with what can be hoped, calling skill, calling medicine, calling love, and beyond them all, calling whatever power might still be listening. And Sekhmet listened, or at least the Egyptians behaved as if she did, which in a ritual world amounts to the same thing often enough. There were spells for this. We know that. Formulae invoking the lioness to back away from the body she had inflamed. Charms naming her epithets one by one, as if precision itself could guide divine mood. Lady of life. Lady of flame. Great of magic. She before whom evil retreats. The paradox is deliberate. She burns. She protects against burning. She sends arrows of plague. She withdraws them. If you were standing beside such a sickbed with me, you would hear the layers. The scrape of a stool being pulled nearer. The wet ring of cloth over a bowl. The small involuntary sounds a feverish person makes. Never dramatic. Somehow more distressing because of that. Outside, a donkey shifts. Somewhere beyond the wall, another family is still talking quietly over supper. Ordinary life goes on with extraordinary indifference. That may be the loneliest part of illness in any age. In the lamplight, an image of Sekhmet might hang or stand nearby. Small, portable, household scale. Not monumental terror now, but concentrated presence. Her lioness face rendered in lines meant to fit the palm. A reminder that cosmic forces can be invited into domestic space if approached properly. The family does not want her greatness in full. No one sane would. They want the moderated version, the seated one, the listening one, the one who has already had her red drink and is willing to spare this room. The same logic follows soldiers into battle. Imagine a young man before campaign season, bronze fitted, sandals checked, provisions bundled, trying to appear composed before older veterans who have already learned the uselessness of swagger. He enters a chapel or small shrine and leaves a little offering. Bread, beer, a flower if one can be spared. A whispered request. Not simply for victory, for survival through the heat of combat, through arrows, through confusion, through the hot blind flood that can take hold of men once striking begins. Sekhmet is a natural patron for such moments because battle resembles epidemic in one crucial way. It spreads. It leaps from body to body. It enters order and turns order into panic unless controlled by superior force. A king may claim her openly in inscriptions, but the ordinary soldier approaches her more nervously. He knows what lioness rage looks like from the wrong side. There is humor in this too, dark and human. One can imagine a veteran muttering to a nervous younger comrade that if Sekhmet notices them at all, let it be in a good mood. And if not a good mood, then at least a distracted one. Humans do this. We joke near the edge because solemnity alone becomes too heavy to lift. Women in childbirth also moved under her shadow more than they might have wished. Labor brought blood, danger, heat, pain, and the possibility of infection after. Again, the lioness stood at the threshold between harm and deliverance. Protective spells in such contexts might invoke multiple deities, of course, but the very atmosphere of danger belonged partly to Sekhmet's domain. She knew the body in extremity. She knew the red line between life continuing and life failing. It is telling that Egyptian religion did not reserve divine attention only for the clean or ceremonial parts of life. Birth, sickness, menstruation, battle wounds, plague, aging flesh. All of it belonged to a world the gods inhabited. Sekhmet's presence in those zones made the religion honest in a way I deeply admire. Terrifyingly honest. Yes, but honest. It admitted that the sacred is not always comforting. Sometimes it enters the room wearing a lioness face and asks whether you have remembered your dependents yet. This is where temple ritual and personal fear met. Priests did not conduct great public rites in some abstract sphere detached from household suffering. Their ceremonies mattered because ordinary people needed the goddess managed at scale. Processions, recitations, offerings, festival intoxications, daily feedings of divine statues. All of this was public maintenance of cosmic mood. The temple was not theater. It was preventative care for reality. What a sentence that is. Preventative care for reality. Very Egyptian. Very beautiful. Slightly exhausting. If the daily rites were neglected, if the statues went unfed, if incense failed to rise, if words were misremembered, what then? The answer in Egyptian thought was not usually immediate apocalypse. It was imbalance, gradual dangerous slippage, a hotter season, a worse fever, a king who became too violent, a Nile that did not behave, a sense that the lioness had become less seated. That same concern explains why statues mattered even beyond artistry. A statue was not mere reminder. It was a body available for indwelling, a point of contact, a place where offerings could arrive and presence could settle. To set Sekhmet in stone was to give dangerous power a seat, and therefore a chance to remain seated. Rows upon rows of lioness statues are not vanity projects when read this way. They are a civilizational nervous system. The black stone chosen so often for her is perfect. Dense, dark, cool to the touch even in warm air. It absorbs light rather than scattering it. You stand before such a figure and feel not theatrical menace, but compressed seriousness. Like storm clouds given posture, like a judgment that has agreed. For now, to wait. I imagine ordinary Egyptians did not all respond to Sekhmet in one uniform emotional register. Some would have loved her fiercely, grateful for recoveries, for protections believed received, for daughters surviving birth, for sons returning from campaigns, for old age reached after illnesses that should have ended otherwise. Some would have feared her without warmth, leaving offerings the way one pays a dangerous official whose goodwill matters. Some would have moved between the two positions depending on the year. We can hardly do otherwise ourselves with the forces that govern our lives. There are inscriptions that praise her beauty. That may surprise some people. But beauty in Egyptian thought is not harmless prettiness. Beauty can be luminous force, order correctly manifested. A lioness can be beautiful because precision is beautiful, because power restrained into form is beautiful, because terror kept seated long enough to become protection is beautiful. And then there is old age. Picture an elderly Egyptian man whose joints ache in the cool morning and burn at noon. He has seen children buried and grandchildren born. He has watched dynastic rhetoric rise and fall, while the Nile kept doing what the Nile does. Perhaps he carries an old scar from military service. Perhaps he once recovered from a fever that should have taken him. When he lights incense before Sekhmet now, what does he feel? Gratitude, bargaining, habit, awe, weariness. Likely all of them at once. He has outlived enough to know that survival is never purely earned. Something always intervenes. Luck, skill, kin, gods, timing, the right herb, the right flood, The right person waking at the right hour to notice a worsening breath. Sekhmet in such a life is not merely the possibility of sudden death. She is the long record of all the times death passed near and did not quite choose him. There is a softness in that realization, even under a lioness gaze. By now the sun is lowering in our imagined Egypt. Temple walls glow honey gold. Shadows stretch from the feet of statues like dark water. A physician rolls up linens after a patient has finally begun to cool. Somewhere, a mother unties an amulet from her now sleeping child and kisses it before placing it near the household shrine. Somewhere, a soldier back from campaign pours out a little beer before drinking the rest himself. A quiet thanks and a quiet plea for mercy. Sekhmet remains. She remains in carved stone and in spells, in the hot logic of fevers, in the protective hand of medicine, in royal ideology, in festival drunkenness, in the hush of rooms where life hangs in the balance. The old myth of human destruction and divine intoxication was never left behind. It kept translating itself into daily Egyptian feeling. That is the part many summaries miss. A myth survives because people keep finding themselves inside its structure. Egyptian mothers with sick children lived inside Sekhmet's structure. Kings, tempted by excessive force, lived inside it. Healers trying to reverse a burning illness lived inside it. Festival crowds with cups in hand lived inside it too, celebrating the mercy that arrives when red liquid becomes joy rather than slaughter. And this brings us toward the final turn of the story. Because if Sekhmet's memory settled so deeply into Egyptian life, what does that tell us about Egypt itself? About a civilization that refused to split healing from harm, joy from terror, kingship from catastrophe, divine beauty from divine blood, hunger. We need one more step, one last movement outward and inward at once. From the rooms of ordinary fear back to the great question, the myth leaves smoldering beneath all its lioness grace. What sort of civilization survives by honoring not only the gods who comfort it, but the gods who nearly destroyed it? So let us take that final step now, slowly, and with a steady breath. What sort of civilization survives by honoring not only the gods who soothe it, but the goddesses who nearly destroyed it? Egypt, I think, survived by refusing the fantasy of harmless order. That may be the deepest thing Sekhmet ever taught them. Order was real, yes. They called it mat, balance, truth, rightness, the beautiful arrangement by which river, king, temple, field, family, and star each kept to their proper course. But Ma'at was never imagined as soft furniture placed in a safe room. It was a structure built beside flood, drought, fever, grief, invasion, and time. It had to hold against all of that, which meant the Egyptians could not afford a childish religion. They needed gods who could look directly at disaster without blinking. Sekhmet is one of the clearest signs of that maturity. She is not a mistake in the system. She is part of the system. That is the uncomfortable brilliance of her. The same sun that warms grain can crack the ground. The same ruler who protects borders can become tyranny if he forgets measure. The same blood that carries life can spill from the body and end it. The same red liquid that once nearly became the end of humanity can become the drink that saves the world. Egypt saw these reversals everywhere. Sekhmet simply wore them openly. If you stand beside the Nile long enough, you begin to understand why. The river is generous, but never sentimental. It gives fertility by flooding, and too much or too little flood brings anxiety at once. Silt builds fields. Water also destroys walls. Reeds whisper in the shallows. Crocodiles wait there too. Beauty and threat are not opposite camps in such a landscape. They share the same bank. They breathe the same dawn air. Honestly, I think that is why Egyptian religion feels so strangely calm, even when it speaks about terrifying things. It is not calm because the world is gentle. It is calm because terror has already been admitted into the room and given its proper name. Sekhmet was one of those names. And because she was named, she could be approached. Because she could be approached, she could be honored. Because she could be honored, she might be turned, cooled, seated, satisfied, transformed from the forward rush of punishment into the watchful stillness of protection. This is not naive optimism. It is ritual realism, a culture saying, we know what can happen, and we know pretending otherwise is useless. So let us make forms strong enough to meet it. That helps explain why Egyptian art so often looks composed, even when the theology beneath it trembles with danger. A lioness goddess sits with perfect posture. A king smites enemies in formal serenity. A funerary procession moves in ordered sequence. A healing text lists symptoms and spells with the same careful hand. Form itself becomes a defense. Repetition becomes reassurance. Beauty becomes discipline. You can see this in the temple statue programs we spoke about earlier. One Sekhmet is a deity. 100 Sekhmets begins to feel like a strategy. A corridor of lioness forms does something to the mind. It tells you that danger has been counted, multiplied, spaced, carved, and brought into pattern. Not eliminated. Never that. Patterned. In a civilization as old as Egypt, that difference mattered more than any dream of final victory. That is true of death as well. Egyptian culture is often described through tombs, mummies, and the afterlife. And fair enough. They were astonishingly committed to continuity. But what interests me here is the emotional posture beneath all that labor. They did not deny mortality. They worked around it, through it, against it, and with it. Sekhmet fits that posture perfectly. She is a reminder that the same cosmos that sustains you also contains your ending. So prepare, purify, offer, inscribe, heal. Remember, none of these actions abolish danger. They make danger negotiable. It is a very elegant refusal of despair. And it may be one reason Egypt endured so long through changing dynasties, foreign occupations, internal collapses, recoveries, reforms, and moments when even the gods themselves seem to rearrange their faces. A society that accepts only gentle divinity breaks quickly when the world turns harsh. A society that knows the sacred can arrive as fever, drought, war, or red horizon light has more room to adapt. It has already built language for extremity. Sekhmet gave Egypt that language. She also gave it a warning, one that kings especially should have studied with trembling care. In the old story, wrath becomes nearly impossible to stop once it forgets proportion. Punishment enjoys itself. Correction turns into appetite. The mission is lost inside the thrill of force. If that is not a warning to rulers, I do not know what is. A pharaoh may borrow lioness imagery, may claim divine ferocity against enemies, may boast of burning rebels like straw, but the myth always stands nearby, like a cool-handed priest whispering, "Yes, but remember what happened when the eye was left to its own pleasure." Too much victory can become a curse. That is such a human lesson. Nations forget it. Armies forget it. Families forget it. Individuals definitely forget it, usually right after deciding they are the most reasonable person in the room. The Egyptians, to their credit, preserved the lesson inside beauty. They made the warning memorable. A lioness with a solar disk is harder to ignore than a tidy little moral paragraph. And then there is the matter of joy. I do not want to end this part with only fear, because Egypt did not. Sekhmet's story bends toward pacification, toward feasting, music, drink, festival, and relief. That matters immensely. A civilization cannot live forever in clenched reverence. It needs release. It needs laughter after terror. It needs song after diagnosis. It needs beer, frankly, and the Egyptians were wise enough to know it. A ritualized feast in honor of the goddess was not denial of danger. It was the communal memory that danger had once been turned aside and might be turned aside again. There is something almost medicinal in that. Collective relief as social healing, shared intoxication as a theological argument. We are still here, the festival says. The lioness did not finish the work. The morning came. The children are alive. The Nile still breathes. Pour another cup. If you were in Egypt on such a feast day, perhaps at dusk, you would hear drums start before full dark. You would smell beer, sweat, perfumi, lotus, and lamp oil mingling in warm air. You would hear laughter that is not careless but grateful. You would see women moving with sistra in their hands, musicians half serious and half delighted, old men smiling into cups, younger people trying very hard to look dignified while failing in charming ways. And all of it would carry a memory far older than the celebration itself. Once, the world nearly ended in blood. Tonight, it does not. That memory is what gives the joy its depth. By now, perhaps, you can feel what Sekhmet finally reveals about Egypt. Not simply that the Egyptians feared disease or loved ritual or carved excellent statues, though all true. What she reveals is that they understood civilization as a discipline of balance, maintained against real and recurring forces of dissolution. They knew order was precious because it was vulnerable. They knew healing was holy because the body was fragile. They knew beauty mattered because ugliness was always possible. They knew joy mattered because annihilation had already been imagined in detail. And they did not turn away from any of that. Instead, they built temples, wrote hymns, brewed festival drink, trained healers, carved lioness faces in dark stone, and taught generation after generation how to live near danger without surrendering to panic. That, to me, is one of the noblest things any civilization can do. Still, time has its own appetite. Temples break, names fade, sand enters courts once swept daily by careful feet. Statues fall, or lose faces, or are carried away, or lie buried in patient darkness. New gods come. New empires claim permanence. Old languages become puzzles. Yet Sekhmet does not wholly vanish. She waits in fragments, in museum hush, in excavated granite, in untranslated feelings. Modern people still recognize when they stand before her image and do not quite know why their spine straightens. We can even see the discipline of balance in the way Sekhmet overlaps with other goddesses without fully dissolving into them. Bastet softens some lioness traits into domestic grace and feline charm, yet traces of old danger remain under the perfume. Hathor can soothe, intoxicate, embrace, and delight. Yet in some theological currents, she is also the one who becomes Sekhmet when divine joy passes into blazing punishment. Mut absorbs power in Thebes with the patience of a state religion reorganizing the sky. Egypt does this often, braiding deities together, but the braid does not erase the individual fibers. Sekhmet survives every merger by keeping her essential temperature. Hot, bright, corrective. That tells us something else about Egyptian thought. It did not need theological consistency in the modern argumentative sense. It needed functional truth. If a goddess could heal in one hymn, protect the king in another, merge with Hathor in festival, and still stand as lioness plague sender in a medical spell, that was not hypocrisy. It was accuracy through multiplicity. Reality itself arrives from more than one direction. Why should the gods behave more simply than life does? A temple library would have understood this perfectly. Picture shelves or chests of papyri, ritual calendars, medical texts, hymns, offering lists, incantations against snakebite, astronomical observations, all of it part of the same world. A scribe copying Sekhmet titles by lamplight would not have felt he was moving between categories. Healing, kingship, astronomy, flood time, and divine wrath all belonged to one woven order. We divide subjects because we are trained to. Egypt arranged them by relationship. Even architecture participates in the lesson. Consider how temple spaces often move from public brightness toward increasing sacred enclosure. Court, hall, chamber, shrine. One passes from sun-struck openness into filtered dimness, into columns thick as bundled reeds, into rooms where stone swallows sound, and the body slows without permission. To approach Sekhmet in such a setting is already to undergo instruction. Your pace changes. Your voice lowers. You become more exact. The building teaches posture before the goddess even comes into view. By the time you stand before her, you are half prepared simply by having moved correctly through space. That too is civilization. Not merely laws and armies and granaries, but training the nervous system into reverence before power. There were invasions. There were internal failures. There were priesthood struggles, dynastic anxieties, foreign rulers clever enough to adopt Egyptian forms and impatient enough to hollow them out. There were years when temples prospered and years when they starved. Yet Sekhmet logic never quite ceased to be useful. Any period that knew epidemic, political violence, or uncertain kingship could still understand the Lioness, which means almost every period could. And that is where we need to go next. To the afterlife of Sekhmet beyond ancient Egypt, to ruins, museums, broken inscriptions, and the strange modern moment when a lioness goddess from 3,000 years ago still manages to make a room feel warmer, more serious, and very slightly less safe in the most illuminating way. So here we are at last, in the long echo after empire. The temple singers are gone. The physicians who spoke her name over fevered bodies are dust. The kings who compared themselves to her have become museum labels and cracked cartouches. Whole dynasties have thinned into chronology. The breweries are silent. The festival drums have stopped. Courtyards, once full of incense and linen and careful footsteps, now lie open to sun, wind, and the polite vandalism of centuries. And still, Sekhmet remains. Perhaps not everywhere she once stood. Many of her statues were broken, moved, reused, buried, or worn down by time and indifference. But enough remain. Enough to let us feel that old pressure still gathering behind the stone. You enter a museum gallery now. Modern air, cool and filtered. Floors clean, labels discreet. Guards, patient. Visitors whispering with the special hush people reserved for old power. And there she is again. Seated. Upright. Lioness, face untroubled by millennia. Eyes fixed on some point beyond the room, or perhaps directly through it. The first surprise is scale. She is often larger than expected. Densa too. Photographs flatten her. In person, the stone has gravity. It pulls your attention downward and inward. The second surprise is composure. This is not an image caught in frenzy. It is wrath already mastered into pose. That may be why she unsettles modern viewers so effectively. We are used to monsters that snarl. Sekhmet does not need to. She has already passed the point where display is necessary. If you were standing in such a gallery beside me, perhaps with a little brochure folded badly in one hand and the faint sound of climate control humming overhead, I think you would feel what so many people feel without saying much about it. A peculiar doubling. Part of you knows this is stone, archaeology, heritage, art history, catalog number, dynasty, revenants, all the clean modern words. Another part of you, older and less easily trained, feels as though you should lower your voice, not point too casually, and certainly not joke too loudly in front of the lioness. That second feeling interests me. It suggests that whatever Sekhmet represented in ancient Egypt was not wholly dependent on ancient belief. Form can carry an emotional technology across time. Severe posture, leonine face, contained power. All of it still works. Museums have become, in a way, the final temples of such deities. I do not mean that in some melodramatic, mystical sense. I mean that objects once approached with offerings are now approached with scholarship, preservation, and silence. The rituals changed. The atmosphere did not entirely. Curators regulate temperature instead of incense smoke. Conservators clean surfaces instead of priests washing divine bodies. Visitors circle slowly, reading labels instead of hymns, yet reverence still leaks through. Humans remain very good at inventing secular forms of awe. And Sekhmet, frankly, gives us plenty to work with. She also gives modern historians and archaeologists an interpretive headache, which I say with affection. Was a given statue commissioned for healing rites, royal propaganda, calendrical liturgy, temple decoration, or all of them at once? How exactly were mass statue programs used within ritual movement? To what degree did ordinary Egyptians experience Sekhmet primarily as healer, Blage Sender, royal protectress, or cosmic warning? How much did regional cult practice change her emotional texture? Scholarship does what scholarship always does, gently disagreeing in excellent prose. Some scholars lean one way, some another. It is debated, and often for good reason. The evidence is abundant in places and frustratingly partial in others. But uncertainty does not weaken the picture. It may strengthen it. A goddess who lived for so many centuries in so many registers should not collapse into one neat sentence for our convenience. Sekhmet resists simplification because the Egyptians used her to think through realities that remain resistant themselves. Disease is not simple. Violence is not simple. Protection is not simple. Neither is power. And perhaps also the intelligence to seat what would otherwise run wild. That, to me, is the image that stays, not the first rush of slaughter across humanity, though that is unforgettable. Not even the red beer spread over the fields, vivid as that scene is. It is the seated lioness afterward, the one in temple courts, the one in healing chapels, the one in black stone, the one who has been given a place, a posture, an offering, and therefore a relation to the world that is no longer pure devastation. There is wisdom in that image for private life, too. We all have forces in us that resemble Sekhmet more than we like to admit. Rage, grief, appetite, punitive certainty, the hot conviction that we are justified and should keep going. Left untended, such things become their own kind of blood drunkenness. The Egyptians would likely not be shocked by that comparison. They might simply recommend a ritual, a song, a measured cup, a cooling of the body, and a good long think before speaking further. Honestly, that is not bad advice. As the centuries rolled on, Egypt itself became subject to the same truth Sekhmet had always embodied. Greatness does not make one immune to diminishment. Temples close. Scripts die. Memory fragments. Yet fragments endure. A statue base here. A hymn there. A medical papyrus invoking her titles. A damaged face uncovered from sand. A row of seated lionesses reconstructed from shattered distribution across a ruined court. History proceeds not by keeping whole what once existed, but by allowing enough to remain that the pattern can be felt again. And the pattern here is astonishingly clear. Egypt honored dangerous divinity because it understood that survival required relationship with danger, not fantasy of abolition. It transformed fear into liturgy, liturgy into architecture, architecture into memory. It taught that what threatens life may also guard it when properly acknowledged. It preserved that lesson in some of the most beautiful, severe, and psychologically precise religious art ever made. So now we return, not to the temple, not quite, but to this quiet room of thought and candlelight from which we began. Imagine the fire low. Imagine the air cooling just a little. Imagine dust shifting somewhere beyond the threshold. The Nile is far away from us now in miles, but close again in feeling. A river breath in the dark. A museum hush around old stone. Footsteps fading in a corridor. The soft red memory of beer spread over fields to save a world that came too close to ending. Sekhmet sits at the center of all of it. She is wrath and rescue, plague and physician, royal fury and its warning, the hot eye of the sun and the cool discipline that must answer it. She is the lioness who nearly emptied Egypt of its future, and the goddess Egypt trusted to keep its children alive through the night. That contradiction is not a flaw in the myth. It is the myth's truth. And perhaps that is why she still feels alive. Not alive in the childish sense of hidden movement after closing time, though museum guards may have private opinions on that. Alive because the structure she represents continues to describe us. We still live in worlds where punishment exceeds intention, where healing must come from within systems that also wound, where celebration follows catastrophe, where beauty is used to hold terror still long enough to survive it. The Egyptians saw all that with extraordinary clarity. They gave the site a lioness face and a throne. Now the candles are burning lower. The walls around us have gentled into shadow. The old temples are far behind us and strangely near. Somewhere, in stone or memory, Sekhmet remains seated, honored, watchful, dangerous, necessary. And if tonight you carry away anything from her story, let it be this quiet and difficult grace. The world is not made safe by pretending its fiercest powers do not exist. It becomes livable when those powers are recognized, given boundaries, and turned, if only for a while, toward the work of keeping life intact. Egypt knew that. Its healers knew it. Its kings ignored it at their peril. Its mothers whispered it over sickbeds. Its festivals laughed it back into the light. Its statues still hold it in silence. The lioness was never only the end of things. She was also the reason the morning returned. No wonder Sekhmet still feels current. Whole societies forget the price of balance, once balance holds for too long. A healthy generation assumes health is normal. A peaceful generation assumes power is naturally restrained. A prosperous generation assumes systems are self-maintaining. Then the fever comes, or the war, or the ruler who likes force too much, or the season that burns differently. And suddenly the old lioness shape reappears behind modern vocabulary. We call it crisis management, emergency medicine, constitutional limits, public mourning, social repair. Egypt called it other things. But in both cases, human beings are trying to do the same impossible-sounding work. Take what could ruin everything and persuade it to sit down. No wonder Sekhmet still feels current. Perhaps that is why the seated statues matter so much. They are images of aftermath. Not innocence before terror, and not ruin after terror, but the difficult middle state in which destructive power has been brought into relation with order again. There is hope in that, though it is a granite kind of hope. Heavy, earned, unsentimental. That matters because particularity is where old gods live. Not in vague mystique. In details, the solar disk, the lioness muzzle, the black stone, the physician prayer, the red drink spread across fields, the king who borrows her power, the mother who fears her and begs her help in the same breath, the statues seated in row after row, as if one image were not enough to hold the scale of the problem. By this hour, though, I think we have earned a gentler closing. Imagine the Nile, again under evening light. Temple walls cooling, dust settling, beer jars emptying after festival, a physician rinsing his hands, a child sleeping easier at last, a king in some distant chamber being reminded by ritual that power ungoverned is hunger, a stone lioness in the temple court taking the last warmth of the day into her dark body and returning nothing visible but stillness. That stillness travels a very long way. It crosses dynasties, ruin, excavation, empire, museum glass, scholarship, and our own restless age. It reaches this room, this fire, this slow breath, and it offers not comfort exactly, but steadiness. The old Egyptian kind. Look clearly. Name the danger. Do not flatter it. Do not deny it. Do not worship its excess. Seat it. Cool it. Give it boundary. Then live. There are worse instructions to receive from the ancient world. So the story closes where it began, with the lioness and the red horizon, except now the light is lower and the heat has softened. We have seen her as punishment, as plage, as healer, as protector, as royal warning, as festival memory, as statue, as survival method, as philosophical lesson carved in stone. We have seen that Egypt did not endure by imagining a harmless cosmos. It endured by learning how to stand inside a dangerous one with grace. Sekhmet was part of that grace. Not gentle grace, not easy grace, the grace of a civilization that could look at fury, sickness, blood, and death, and still choose to make music. Pour offerings, tend the ill, restrain kings, carve beauty, and wait for morning. The lioness watched all of it. She watches still, as much as any old god can, through stone and story, through scholarship and silence, through the strange fact that human beings continue to recognize themselves in powers first named thousands of years ago on the banks of the Nile. The fire is almost out now. The room is quiet. The dust has settled. The old goddess is seated. Good night.